Hey son, picture a kitchen in 1946. The war is over. Your mother stands at the counter with a can opener in one hand and a recipe card in the other, and she is about to make something that would horrify you now, but seem perfectly reasonable then. The recipes of the 1940s were born from necessity, shaped by rationing, and held together by optimism and gelatin. A lot of gelatin. Tonight we are diving into the recipe boxes and women's magazines of the 1940s, pulling out the dishes that were printed in Good Housekeeping and Better Homes and Gardens, the meals that were served at church potlucks and birthday dinners, the foods that filled American tables when butter was scarce and creativity was mandatory. These are not lost family secrets. These are recipes that were everywhere, and then they were quietly forgotten, buried under decades of better judgment and improved taste. Before we begin, if you are enjoying this, a like or subscribe helps more than you might think. We are also now on Spotify, so if you prefer listening there, the link is in the description. Either way, thank you for being here. Now, consider this. What did dinner taste like in 1947 when half the ingredients were still being rationed and your mother had to make a roast stretch across 3 meals? What did a holiday table look like when gelatin molds were considered elegant and canned pineapple was a luxury? How did people celebrate when sugar was restricted and butter was precious? What did it mean to cook creatively when the pantry was half empty and the grocery store had more gaps than goods? It is 1946 now. The radio is on. Your mother is reading a recipe that calls for Spam, condensed soup, and something called Dream Whip. The oven is warming, and you are about to understand exactly what America was eating when the war ended and the future had not quite arrived yet. The war ended in 1945, but rationing did not. Butter, eggs, and milk were still restricted through 1946 and into 1947. Your mother still had her ration books in the kitchen drawer. She still checked the newspaper for what was available that week. And she still baked cakes because birthdays and holidays did not stop for rationing. The solution was something called victory cake, sometimes called wacky cake or depression cake, a chocolate cake made with no eggs, no butter, and no milk. Just flour, sugar, cocoa, vinegar, vanilla, and water mixed directly in the baking pan. No bowls, no fuss. You made 3 wells in the dry ingredients, poured the liquids in, stirred it together, and baked. The result was surprisingly good, moist, and tender, and nobody at the table knew what was missing unless you told them. Your mother learned the recipe from a neighbor or a magazine clipping taped inside a cupboard door. The instructions were simple enough that you could follow them even if you had never baked before. You greased a square pan, dumped in the flour, the sugar, the cocoa powder, the salt, the baking soda. You used your finger to make 3 little wells in the dry mixture. 1 for the vanilla, 1 for the vinegar, 1 for the vegetable oil. Then you poured water over the whole thing and stirred it with a fork until it was just combined. No sifting, no creaming, no separating. You put it in the oven, and 30 minutes later, you had a cake. The vinegar reacted with the baking soda to give it lift. The oil kept it moist. The cocoa made it taste like chocolate, which covered a multitude of absences. When it came out of the oven, it was dark and level and smelled like a real cake because it was a real cake, just one that had been stripped down to its most essential parts. Your mother sometimes dusted it with powdered sugar. Sometimes she made a thin chocolate glaze with cocoa, sugar, and a little hot water. Sometimes she left it plain and served it with canned peaches on the side. You ate it at birthday parties where every child got a slice on a paper napkin. You ate it after Sunday dinner when company came over and your mother wanted to serve something sweet. You ate it on a Tuesday afternoon because it was there and you were hungry and nobody said you could not. The cake was never fancy, but it was always enough. It tasted like childhood in a specific moment when making do was not a compromise, but a skill. The recipe stayed in circulation long after rationing ended. It showed up in community cookbooks in the 1950s and 60s. It appeared on mimeographed recipe cards passed around at church. Some families kept making it because it was easy and reliable. Some kept making it because they remembered what it meant to bake something sweet when sweet things were scarce. The cake did not need eggs or butter to work, and that simplicity turned out to be its strength. It was proof that you could make something good with almost nothing, which was a useful thing to know in 1946, and turned out to be a useful thing to know in any year after that. When you think of it now, you can still taste it. The soft crumb, the mild chocolate flavor, the way it was just sweet enough. You remember your mother pulling it out of the oven, setting it on the counter to cool, cutting it into squares while it was still warm. You remember that it was never the best cake you ever had, but it was always there when you needed it, which in the end might have been better. Liver was cheap, it was plentiful, and it was pushed hard by home economists and the government as a nutritious, economical protein. Liver and onions was common, but liver loaf took it further. Ground liver mixed with breadcrumbs, onions, eggs, and seasonings, shaped into a loaf, baked, and served sliced like meatloaf. It was dense, gray-brown, and had a mineral tang that children learned to tolerate. The recipe appeared in women's magazines and community cookbooks throughout the 1940s. It was frugal, it was patriotic, and it was deeply unpopular with anyone under the age of 12. But your mother made it anyway, because meat was still tight and liver was not rationed, and a loaf of something was better than a loaf of nothing. The butcher sold liver for pennies a pound. Beef liver, pork liver, sometimes chicken livers if you asked. Your mother brought it home wrapped in brown paper, rinsed it under cold water, and trimmed away the membranes and tubes that ran through it. Then she ground it herself if she had a grinder, or she chopped it fine with a knife if she did not. The liver went into a bowl with soaked bread, beaten eggs, minced onion, salt, pepper, and sometimes a little sage or thyme. She mixed it with her hands, packed it into a loaf pan, and baked it until it was firm. The smell that filled the kitchen was unmistakable. Metallic, rich, slightly sweet. It was not unpleasant if you were used to it, but if you were not, it made you want to leave the house. The loaf came out of the oven dark and solid, and your mother let it rest before slicing it. Each slice was dense and held together well, which made it easy to serve. She usually made a brown gravy to go with it, or sometimes a tomato sauce if she had canned tomatoes on hand. The gravy helped. You sat at the table and ate it because that was what was for dinner. The texture was softer than meatloaf, almost pâté-like, and the flavor was strong and slightly bitter. You learned to take small bites and chew quickly. You learned to eat it with mashed potatoes so the blandness of the potatoes balanced the intensity of the liver. You learned not to complain, because complaining did not change what was on your plate, and your mother had already heard every objection from your older siblings. Liver was considered a superfood before anyone used that word. High in iron, rich in vitamins, good for growing children and tired mothers. The government printed pamphlets about it. Home economists demonstrated liver recipes at county fairs. Nutritionists recommended it in women's magazines. The campaign was relentless and mostly ineffective because liver tasted like liver, and no amount of nutritional information could change that. But your mother kept making it because the budget was what it was, and liver was what she could afford. She made liver loaf on Mondays or Tuesdays, the cheap days of the week, the days when nobody expected anything fancy. She served it with green beans from a can and bread with margarine, and that was dinner. You ate it, your father ate it, your siblings ate it, and then it was over, and you did not have to think about liver again until the next week. Liver loaf disappeared from most tables by the 1960s. Meat became more affordable, and people stopped pretending they liked organ meats out of necessity. But if you ate it as a child, you remember it. The color, the smell, the way it sat heavy in your stomach. You remember that it was food when food was not guaranteed, and that your mother made it not because she wanted to, but because she had to. That knowledge stays with you, even if the taste does not. Gelatin was everywhere in the 1940s. Not just desserts. Salads, side dishes, main courses suspended in shimmering domes of flavored gelatin. Perfection salad was the standard bearer. A lemon gelatin mold filled with shredded cabbage, celery, pimentos, and sometimes vinegar. It was tangy, crunchy, and served on a lettuce leaf with a dollop of mayonnaise. The recipe won a contest in 1905 and stayed in circulation for 50 years. By the 1940s, it was a staple at ladies' luncheons, church suppers, and holiday tables. Gelatin salads were considered elegant, modern, and sophisticated. They proved you had a refrigerator. They showed you had time to fuss. And they were, by today's standards, completely baffling. Your mother made perfection salad in a ring mold or a bundt pan, something with shape and presence. She dissolved the lemon gelatin in boiling water, added cold water and a splash of vinegar, then let it cool until it was slightly thickened. That was the tricky part. If the gelatin was too liquid, the vegetables would sink. If it was too firm, they would not mix in. She waited until it was syrupy, then stirred in the finely shredded cabbage, the diced celery, the chopped pimentos. She poured the mixture into the mold, smoothed the top, and put it in the refrigerator to set. It took hours. You could not rush it. When it was firm, she ran warm water over the outside of the mold, inverted it onto a plate, and lifted the mold away. If it worked, the salad slipped out clean and whole, a perfect dome of pale yellow gelatin with flecks of green and red suspended inside. If it did not work, it came out in pieces, and your mother scraped it back into the mold and tried again. But when it worked, it looked like something from a magazine, shiny, symmetrical, impressive. She set it on the table on a bed of iceberg lettuce, with a small bowl of mayonnaise on the side. You served yourself a wedge, and the gelatin wobbled on your plate. The texture was cold and slippery. The cabbage was still crunchy. The celery added a little bitterness. The pimentos were there for color more than flavor. You ate it with a fork, cutting through the gelatin and trying to get a little of everything in each bite. It was strange, but it was not bad, which was about the best thing anyone said about gelatin salads. The appeal was visual more than culinary. A molded salad looked like effort. It looked like you had planned ahead. It looked like you cared, which in the 1940s was a significant part of hospitality. You did not just throw food on the table. You arranged it. You presented it. You made it look like something, even if that something was cabbage suspended in lemon gelatin. Perfection salad appeared at every potluck, every holiday dinner, every ladies' church meeting. There were always 2 or 3 gelatin molds on the table, and you took a little from each one, because that was polite. Some had fruit, some had vegetables, some had both. Some were sweet, some were savory, some were impossible to categorize. But they were always there, always wobbling, always taking up space on the table like they belonged. The gelatin salad era peaked in the 1950s and early 60s, then collapsed under its own absurdity. People stopped pretending that vegetables needed to be encased in flavored gelatin. They stopped pretending that gelatin salads were elegant. They quietly stopped making them And by the 1970s, perfection salad had been perfected right out of existence. But if you were at a table in 1947, you ate it. And if you ate it, you remember exactly what it looked like, even if you cannot quite explain why anyone thought it was a good idea. This was called SOS by soldiers, which stood for something your mother would not say out loud. Creamed chipped beef on toast, dried beef, the kind that came in a glass jar, rinsed to remove some of the salt, then simmered in a white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, served over toasted bread. It was cheap, it was filling, and it was breakfast or dinner, depending on the day. The beef was salty and chewy. The sauce was thick and bland. The toast got soggy. But it was protein, it was hot, and it used ingredients that were available when fresh meat was not. After the war, it remained popular because people were used to it, and because habits formed during hard times do not disappear just because the hard times end. Your mother kept a jar of chipped beef in the cupboard. It sat next to the canned soup and the evaporated milk, things that did not spoil and could be pulled out when the grocery money was running low. The beef came in thin, irregular slices, pressed together in the jar, dark red and leathery. It was dried and salted, preserved in a way that made it safe to store for months. When she needed it, she opened the jar, pulled out a handful of the slices, and ran them under cold water to wash away some of the salt. Not all of it. You wanted some salt left, or the whole thing would taste like nothing. She made a roux in a saucepan, melting butter and stirring in flour until it was smooth and pale. Then she added milk slowly, whisking it until the sauce thickened. The beef went in next, torn into strips, and she stirred it until everything was hot and combined. The sauce was creamy and white, and the beef turned it faintly pink. She toasted bread, usually white bread, sometimes whole wheat if that was what was available, and ladled the creamed beef over the top. The toast softened under the weight of the sauce, but it held together long enough to get it to your mouth. You ate it with a fork, cutting through the soggy toast and scooping up the beef. The flavor was mild and salty, and the texture was soft except for the occasional chewy piece of beef that had not softened completely. It was not delicious, but it was satisfying in a plain, filling way. It was the kind of food that kept you going without asking for your enthusiasm. Creamed chipped beef on toast was standard fare in the military during the war. Men in training camps and on bases ate it for breakfast, and the name SOS spread through every branch of the service. The initials stood for something vulgar, something that captured the soldier's opinion of the dish. But it was also something they ate without complaint, because it was what was served. When those men came home, they brought the recipe with them, and it moved from the mess hall to the kitchen table without much adjustment. Your father might have eaten it during his time in the service. He might have mentioned it once or twice, without enthusiasm, but without real complaint. And your mother might have made it because she knew he was familiar with it, or because it was easy, or because the ingredients were cheap and reliable. The reasons did not matter much. What mattered was that it was dinner. And dinner was something that happened every night, and creamed chipped beef on toast was a dinner that required almost no thought and even less money. The dish stayed on tables through the 1950s, mostly in working-class households where economy still mattered. It appeared in community cookbooks and church recipe collections. It was not celebrated, but it was included, which meant people were still making it and still feeding it to their families. By the 1960s, it had mostly disappeared, replaced by convenience foods that were easier and did not come with a vulgar nickname. But if you ate it, you remember the taste. Salty, creamy, plain. And you remember the toast, soft and heavy, soaking up the sauce until it could barely hold itself together. It was not the worst thing you ever ate. It was just one more thing that got you through. Spam became a household staple during the war and stayed there long after. It was shelf-stable, required no refrigeration before opening, and could be fried, baked, or eaten cold. Spam and pineapple casserole combined sliced spam, canned pineapple rings, brown sugar, and cloves, baked until caramelized. Sometimes it included sweet potatoes. The combination of salty processed meat and sweet fruit was considered a sophisticated flavor pairing. The recipe appeared in Hormel promotional materials and women's magazines. It was served at dinner parties. It was considered company food. And it was, by any current measure, an absolute crime against pineapple. The casserole dish sat in the oven, bubbling and browning, filling the kitchen with a smell that was half ham, half candy. Your mother arranged the spam slices in a single layer in the bottom of the dish, then placed pineapple rings on top of each slice. She sprinkled brown sugar over everything, stuck a clove in the center of each pineapple ring, and sometimes added a maraschino cherry for color. If she was feeling ambitious, she arranged sweet potato slices around the edges. The whole thing went into the oven until the sugar melted and caramelized, and the spam browned at the edges. When it came out, it looked impressive. The pineapple rings were golden and glossy. The spam had crisped up slightly. The sauce in the bottom of the dish was thick and sweet. Your mother brought it to the table in the casserole dish, set it on a trivet, and served it with a large spoon. Each person got a slice of spam with a pineapple ring on top, and some of the sweet glaze spooned over it. It was served with rice or mashed potatoes, something bland to balance the sweetness. The flavor was aggressively sweet and salty at the same time. The spam had a firm, smooth texture, almost like a dense sausage, and the pineapple was soft and syrupy. The cloves added a sharp, almost medicinal note that cut through the sugar. It was a lot. Every bite was a lot. But people ate it, and some people even liked it, because the combination of sweet and savory was considered sophisticated in the 1940s. It showed you knew how to cook something interesting, something beyond plain meat and potatoes. Spam and pineapple casserole was company food, which meant it was saved for occasions when you wanted to impress someone, or at least show that you had made an effort. Your mother served it when relatives came to visit, or when the neighbors were invited for dinner, or when someone from church stopped by and stayed long enough that refusing to feed them would have been rude. The casserole said, "I planned this. I put thought into this. I am a good hostess." Even if what it really said was, "I opened 2 cans and put them in a dish." The recipe stayed popular through the 1950s. Hormel promoted it heavily, and canned pineapple was cheap and easy to keep on hand. The casserole appeared in magazine spreads showing perfect tables with perfect families, and your mother saw those spreads and believed that this was what dinner was supposed to look like. She believed that serving spam with pineapple and brown sugar was not just acceptable, but desirable. And in the context of 1947, when canned goods were modern and convenience was aspirational, maybe it was. But the dish did not survive. By the 1970s, people had stopped pretending the spam was fancy, and the casserole disappeared from tables. It remained in community cookbooks, yellowed and stained, a relic of a time when opening cans and arranging their contents in a dish counted as cooking. If you ate it as a child, you remember the sweetness more than anything else. The way the brown sugar sauce pooled in the bottom of the dish. The way the pineapple turned almost translucent in the oven. The way your mother served it with pride. And you ate it without comment, because that was what children did. When apples were expensive or unavailable, you made mock apple pie. The filling was not apples. It was Ritz crackers soaked in a sugar syrup flavored with lemon juice and cinnamon. The crackers broke down into something that had the texture of cooked apples, though not the flavor. The recipe was printed on the back of the Ritz cracker box starting in the 1930s, and remained popular through the 40s and 50s. Somehow, it worked. The crackers softened, the syrup thickened, and if you did not think too hard about what you were eating, it tasted close enough to apple pie that you could serve it without apology. It was a trick, but it was a good trick, and in a time when making do was a virtue, that was enough. Your mother made the pie crust first, rolling out pastry dough and fitting it into a pie pan. She made the syrup on the stove, boiling water, sugar, cream of tartar, and lemon juice until it was thick and sweet. Then she broke up a stack of Ritz crackers and layered them in the bottom crust, poured the hot syrup over them, and added dots of butter and a heavy shake of cinnamon. She covered it with the top crust, crimped the edges, cut vents for steam, and baked it until the crust was golden. The pie came out of the oven looking exactly like an apple pie. The crust was flaky and browned. The filling bubbled up through the vents. The smell was cinnamon and sugar and butter, all the right smells. When your mother cut into it, the filling looked convincingly apple-like. The crackers had absorbed the syrup and softened it to translucent pieces that had the texture of cooked fruit. They did not taste like apples exactly. They tasted like sweet, soft crackers. But the cinnamon and lemon gave it enough apple character that your brain filled in the rest. You ate a slice warm, maybe with a scoop of vanilla ice cream if there was any in the freezer. The crust was buttery and crumbled under your fork. The filling was sweet and soft, with a slight grittiness from the crackers that was not entirely unpleasant. It was not as good as real apple pie, but it was not bad, and more importantly, it was possible. You could make it in January when apples were expensive. You could make it in July when apples were not yet ripe. You could make it any time you wanted pie, but did not have the fruit. The recipe was born out of necessity, but it survived because it was clever. It proved that you could make something from almost nothing, that a stack of crackers and some pantry staples could become dessert. That kind of ingenuity mattered in the 1940s. It mattered to housewives who had to stretch budgets and make meals out of whatever was on hand. It mattered to families who wanted treats but could not always afford them. Mock apple pie was proof that wanting something and not being able to have it did not mean you had to go without. It just meant you had to get creative. The recipe stayed on the back of the Ritz cracker box for decades. It appeared in cookbooks and recipe cards. People made it, served it, and sometimes did not tell their guests what was in it until after they had eaten it. The reveal was part of the fun. You would wait until someone had finished their slice, then casually mention that there were no apples in it, and watch their face as they tried to reconcile what they had tasted with what they had just learned. Most people were surprised. Some were impressed. A few were horrified. But they had already eaten it, and they had liked it, so the horror was mostly theoretical. Mock apple pie is still made occasionally, usually by people who remember it from childhood, or who stumble across the recipe and decide to try it out of curiosity. It is a novelty now, a conversation piece, a relic of a time when substitutions were normal and nobody expected ingredients to be authentic. But in 1946, it was just pie. And pie was always welcome, no matter what it was made from. These were meatballs made with ground beef and uncooked white rice mixed together, shaped into balls, and simmered in tomato sauce. As the meatballs cooked, the rice absorbed liquid and expanded, poking out of the meat like porcupine quills. They were easy to make, stretched the meat further, and provided starch and protein in one dish. The recipe was everywhere in the 1940s, appearing in community cookbooks, magazine columns, and handwritten recipe boxes. They were mild, soft, and strangely comforting. Children liked them because they looked funny. Mothers liked them because they used less meat. And they remain one of the more reasonable recipes from the era, which says something about the competition. Your mother made them on a weeknight, when time was short and the grocery budget was tight. She mixed the ground beef with uncooked rice, a beaten egg, some minced onion, salt, and pepper. The rice was raw, just poured straight from the box into the bowl. She mixed everything with her hands until it was combined, then rolled it into balls about the size of a walnut. The raw rice made the mixture looser than regular meatballs, harder to shape. But she managed. She lined the meatballs up on a plate and set them aside while she made the sauce. The sauce was simple. Canned tomato sauce, maybe some tomato juice or water to thin it out, a little sugar to cut the acidity, salt, pepper, and if she had it, a bay leaf. She poured the sauce into a large skillet or pot, brought it to a simmer, then carefully lowered the meatballs into the sauce. They sank down, and she spooned sauce over the top of each one. Then she covered the pot and let them simmer for 45 minutes to an hour. During that time, the rice cooked inside the meatballs, absorbing liquid from the sauce and from the meat itself. The rice expanded, and as it did, the grains pushed out through the surface of the meatballs, creating little spiky points that gave the dish its name. When the meatballs were done, she lifted the lid, and the rice was fully cooked, tender and visible on the outside. The meatballs had swelled slightly and were soft and fragile, but they held together if you were careful. She served them in shallow bowls with plenty of sauce spooned over the top, and sometimes a slice of bread to soak up the extra. You ate them with a fork, cutting through the soft meat and rice, and the flavor was mild and tomatoey and familiar. Nothing shocking, nothing strange, just meatballs and rice and sauce, combined in a way that saved money and time. Children liked porcupine meatballs because they had a name and a shape that made them interesting. You could look at your plate and see the rice poking out, and it looked like something from a nature book, something with a story. Adults liked them because they were practical. A pound of ground beef that might have made 10 regular meatballs could make 15 or 20 porcupine meatballs, and the rice filled you up just as much as more meat would have. It was efficient, and efficiency was a virtue in 1946. The recipe stayed in circulation for decades. It appeared in Betty Crocker cookbooks, in church fundraiser collections, in handwritten cards filed in metal boxes on kitchen counters. Porcupine meatballs were never fancy, but they were never meant to be. They were everyday food, the kind of thing you made on a Tuesday when nobody expected anything special. They were reliable and unpretentious and tasted like someone's mother had made them, because someone's mother always had. The dish is still made occasionally, usually by people who remember eating it as children and want to recreate that memory for their own kids. The reaction is usually the same. The children think the name is funny, the meatballs look weird, and the taste is fine. Not exciting, but fine. Which is exactly how porcupine meatballs were supposed to be. They were never trying to be the best thing you ever ate. They were just trying to be dinner, and in that modest goal, they succeeded completely. This was a spice cake made with a can of condensed tomato soup. The soup replaced some of the fat and liquid, added moisture, and contributed a subtle sweetness that most people could not identify. The cake was dense, dark, and usually topped with cream cheese frosting. It appeared in Campbell's promotional materials and spread through community cookbooks. The recipe made sense in the 1940s when canned soup was cheap, reliable, and considered a modern convenience. The tomato flavor was not obvious in the finished cake. It just tasted like spice cake, which is probably why the recipe survived as long as it did. Some people still make it. Most people still do not tell you what is in it until after you have eaten it. Your mother opened the can of tomato soup and poured it into a mixing bowl. It came out thick and red-orange, looking exactly like what it was. Then she added flour, sugar, baking soda, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and a little salt. She mixed it together, and the soup turned the batter a deep rust color. It did not look like normal cake batter. It looked like something that might be a mistake. But your mother had made this cake before, and she knew it would work. She poured the batter into a greased pan and baked it. The kitchen filled with the smell of warm spices, cinnamon, and cloves mostly. The same smells that came from gingerbread or spice cookies. There was no tomato smell. Whatever tomato character the soup had when it was in the can disappeared completely in the heat of the oven, transformed into something else, something that just read as sweet and spiced and rich. When the cake came out, it was dark and level and slightly domed in the center. Your mother let it cool, then made a cream cheese frosting, the kind that was soft and tangy and sweet all at once. She spread the frosting thick, covering the top and sides, and the white frosting against the dark cake looked clean and appealing. She cut it into squares and served it on small plates, and you ate it with a fork, taking small bites, tasting the spice and the sweetness and the slight tang from the cream cheese. The cake was moist, almost dense, with a tight crumb that held together well. The spices were warm and balanced, not too strong, and the sweetness was restrained. It tasted like a good spice cake. It tasted like something you would want a second piece of. And unless your mother told you, you would never know there was tomato soup in it. The soup was invisible. It was camouflaged by the spices, absorbed into the structure of the cake, and transformed into something completely different from what it had been. Campbell's Soup Company promoted the recipe heavily in the 1940s and 50s. It appeared in advertisements on the back of soup cans and booklets of recipes handed out at grocery stores. The company wanted people to see soup as more than just soup. They wanted it to be an ingredient, a shortcut, a modern convenience that made cooking easier and more interesting. Tomato soup cake was proof of that concept. It was proof that a can of soup could become dessert, that everyday ingredients could be transformed into something special. The recipe spread through community cookbooks and recipe boxes, passed from neighbor to neighbor, mother to daughter. It became one of those recipes that people made without really thinking about why. It worked, it tasted good, and it used something that was already in the pantry. That was enough. Nobody needed to understand the chemistry of why condensed tomato soup made a good cake. They just needed to know that it did. Tomato soup cake is still made today, though not as often as it once was. It shows up in vintage recipe collections and food blogs about mid-century cooking. People make it out of curiosity or nostalgia, or a desire to try something unusual. And most of the time, they are surprised by how good it is. The cake does not taste weird or experimental. It just tastes like spice cake, which is what it always was. The soup is a trick, a secret, a bit of kitchen magic that only the baker knows about. And that secret is part of the appeal. You serve the cake, people eat it and compliment it, and then you tell them what is in it, and their faces change. Surprise, disbelief, sometimes a little disgust. But they already ate it, and they already liked it. So the disgust is just theoretical, just a reaction to the idea of tomato soup in a cake, not the reality of it. The reality is that it worked. It still works. And that is worth remembering. Prunes were promoted aggressively in the 1940s, not for flavor, but for digestive health. Prune whip was a dessert made from stewed prunes, beaten egg whites, sugar, and lemon juice, folded together and chilled. It was light, airy, and had a dark purple-brown color that did not photograph well. The texture was mousse-like. The flavor was sweet and faintly medicinal. It was served at ladies' luncheons and church socials, often with a dollop of whipped cream to make it look more appealing. Prune whip was considered elegant and healthful. It was neither, but it was made often, served without complaint, and remembered with a kind of horrified fondness by anyone who encountered it as a child. Your mother stewed the prunes first, simmering them in water until they were soft and swollen. Then she drained them, removed the pits, and mashed them into a thick paste. The paste was dark and sticky, and it smelled faintly of caramel and something less identifiable, something that suggested medicine or old-fashioned candy. She set the prune paste aside and turned to the egg whites, separating them carefully from the yolks and beating them in a bowl until they formed stiff peaks. The egg whites were bright white and glossy, and they looked nothing like the prune paste sitting next to them. She folded the prune paste into the egg whites gently, trying not to deflate the foam. The mixture turned a mottled purple-brown, streaked with white, and the texture was soft and airy. She added sugar and a squeeze of lemon juice, folded it a few more times, then spooned the mixture into small glass dishes or custard cups. The whip went into the refrigerator to chill, and it set up slightly, becoming firmer but still light and mousse-like. When it was time to serve, your mother topped each dish with a spoonful of whipped cream and maybe a maraschino cherry for color. The whipped cream covered most of the purple-brown surface, which was probably intentional. Prune whip did not look appealing on its own. It looked medicinal, which in a way it was. Prunes were promoted for regularity, for digestive health, for keeping things moving. That message was everywhere in the 1940s. Advertisements, magazine articles, pamphlets from the California Prune Board. Prunes were good for you. Prunes were necessary. And prune whip was a way to make prunes feel like a treat instead of a chore. You ate it with a small spoon, taking careful bites. The texture was light and airy, almost like a cloud, but the flavor was heavy and sweet and slightly medicinal. The prunes tasted like prunes, which was to say they tasted like fruit that had been dried and concentrated and was now insisting on your attention. The lemon juice helped, cutting through the sweetness and adding a little brightness. The whipped cream helped even more, providing a neutral, creamy layer between you and the prunes. But there was no escaping what you were eating. It was prunes. It was always prunes. Prune whip appeared at ladies' luncheons and church socials throughout the 1940s and 50s. It was served in small portions in glass dishes on plates with doilies. It was presented as something refined, something delicate, and appropriate for polite company. And the women who attended those luncheons ate it politely, making small talk and pretending it was a perfectly normal dessert. Maybe some of them liked it. Maybe some of them had been eating prunes their whole lives and found the whip to be a pleasant variation. But most of them probably ate it because it was there, and because refusing would have been rude. Children hated prune whip. The color was off-putting, the flavor was strange, and the whole thing felt like a trick. It looked like dessert. It was served like dessert. But it tasted like something your grandmother would give you when you were not feeling well. It tasted like obligation, like something that was supposed to be good for you and therefore could not possibly be good. If you were served prune whip at a family gathering, you ate it slowly, taking the smallest possible bites, and hoped that nobody was watching closely enough to notice you were not finishing it. Prune whip disappeared sometime in the 1960s, quietly and without announcement. People stopped making it, stopped serving it, and stopped pretending it was a dessert anyone wanted. Prunes themselves fell out of favor, replaced by other dried fruits that did not carry the same medicinal associations. But if you ate prune whip as a child, you remember it. You remember the color, the texture, the way it sat in the glass dish, looking like something that should not be eaten. You remember the taste, sweet and heavy and faintly wrong. And you remember being glad when it was over, when the dish was empty and you could move on to something else, anything else. Canned salmon was affordable and widely available. Salmon loaf combined canned salmon, breadcrumbs, eggs, milk, and seasonings, shaped into a loaf, baked, and served sliced with white sauce or pea sauce. It was pink, flaky, and had a faint metallic flavor from the can. Sometimes it included the bones and skin from the canned salmon, which were soft enough to eat and added calcium. The recipe was practical and economical. Fresh salmon was expensive. Canned salmon was not. And a loaf of something made dinner feel more substantial than it was. Salmon loaf appeared on tables throughout the 1940s, usually on Fridays, and usually without enthusiasm. Your mother opened the can with a manual can opener, the kind that left a jagged edge and required effort. She dumped the salmon into a bowl, and it came out in a solid cylinder, pink and moist, with the bones and skin still intact. The bones were soft and pale, almost translucent, and they crumbled easily when you pressed them. The skin was dark and slippery. Your mother mashed everything together with a fork, breaking up the salmon and mixing in the bones and skin until it was a uniform pink paste. She added breadcrumbs, beaten eggs, a little milk, some minced onion, salt, pepper, and maybe a squeeze of lemon juice if there was a lemon in the house. She mixed it all together with her hands, then packed it into a loaf pan, smoothing the top so it was even. The loaf went into the oven and baked until it was firm and slightly browned on top. The smell that filled the kitchen was fishy, but not unpleasant. A mild seafood smell that reminded you of the ocean, even if you had never been there. When the loaf was done, your mother let it rest for a few minutes, then turned it out onto a platter. She sliced it like meatloaf, and each slice was pink and flaky, studded with bits of bread and onion. Sometimes she made a white sauce to go with it, a simple bechamel with butter, flour, and milk. Sometimes she made a pea sauce, adding cooked peas to the white sauce for color and texture. The sauce covered the salmon, making it look more appealing and adding moisture to each bite. You ate it with a fork, and the texture was soft and slightly crumbly. The salmon tasted like canned salmon, which was mild and slightly metallic, with a flavor that was recognizable but not particularly strong. The bones added a slight grittiness, but they were so soft that you barely noticed them. The breadcrumbs made the loaf hold together, and the eggs gave it richness. The sauce helped everything, adding creaminess and making the whole thing easier to swallow. Salmon loaf was Friday food in many Catholic households, part of the tradition of abstaining from meat on Fridays. It was also budget food, served in homes where money was tight and fresh. Fish was out of reach. Canned salmon cost pennies compared to fresh, and a single can could feed a family of 4 when mixed with enough breadcrumbs and eggs. It was practical, economical, and reliable. You could keep cans of salmon in the pantry and pull them out whenever you needed a quick protein. The recipe appeared in community cookbooks and women's magazines throughout the 1940s. It was included in sections on economical meals, budget dinners, and Friday fish dishes. Salmon loaf was never presented as glamorous or exciting. It was presented as sensible, as a solution to the problem of how to feed a family without spending much money. And in that context, it made perfect sense. It was food that worked, food that stretched, food that got you through. Salmon loaf is still made occasionally, mostly by older cooks who remember it from their childhood, or by people who are curious about mid-century cooking. The reaction is usually the same. It is fine. Not great, not terrible, just fine. The texture is soft, the flavor is mild, and the whole thing feels a little sad, like a compromise between what you want and what you can afford, which is exactly what it was in 1946. A compromise, a practical solution, a loaf of something when you could not have something better. And if that sounds bleak, it is worth remembering that most people at the time did not find it bleak at all. They found it normal. They found it acceptable, and they ate it without complaint. Because it was dinner, and dinner was what you ate, and questioning it would not have changed anything. This was cooked chicken, diced and suspended in lemon, or chicken-flavored gelatin, molded, chilled, and served sliced. Sometimes it included celery, pimentos, and hard-boiled eggs. The gelatin held it together. The chicken provided protein. The presentation suggested elegance, even if the reality did not. Jellied chicken loaf was served cold, often on a bed of lettuce, with mayonnaise on the side. It appeared at buffets, luncheons, and potlucks. The recipe made sense when refrigeration was still new and impressive, when cold molded dishes signaled modernity and sophistication. It made less sense once people realized the chicken did not need to be suspended in gelatin to be good. Your mother made jellied chicken loaf the day after she roasted a chicken. She took the leftover meat, pulled it from the bones, and diced it into small, uniform cubes. The meat went into a bowl while she made the gelatin base. She dissolved lemon or unflavored gelatin in hot chicken broth, the kind she had made from the bones and scraps, then let it cool until it was slightly thickened. The timing mattered. If the gelatin was too thin, the chicken would sink to the bottom. If it was too thick, the ingredients would not mix in smoothly. When the gelatin reached the right consistency, she folded in the diced chicken, some finely chopped celery for crunch, diced pimentos for color, and sometimes sliced hard-boiled eggs. She poured the mixture into a loaf pan or ring mold, smoothed the top, and set it in the refrigerator. It took hours to set completely, usually overnight. The next day, she ran warm water over the outside of the mold, worked a knife around the edges, and inverted it onto a serving platter. If everything went right, the loaf slid out in one piece, glossy and translucent, with the chicken and vegetables visible inside like specimens in amber. She arranged lettuce leaves around the base, placed the loaf in the center, and set out a small bowl of mayonnaise. The presentation was the point. The loaf looked impressive, like something you would see at a hotel buffet or a fancy luncheon. It looked like effort. It looked like planning. And in the 1940s, when appearance mattered as much as taste, that was significant. You served yourself a slice, and the gelatin wobbled on your plate. It was cold and slippery, and the texture was strange. The chicken was tender and mild. The celery added crunch. The pimentos were bland and decorative. The gelatin itself tasted like chicken broth, but cold and gelatinous, which was not unpleasant, but also not particularly appealing. You ate it with a fork, cutting through the gelatin and trying to get a bit of chicken in every bite. The mayonnaise helped, adding richness and covering up the fact that you were essentially eating cold chicken soup that had been set into a solid form. Jellied chicken loaf appeared at every ladies' luncheon, every church potluck, every bridal or baby shower. It was standard fare, expected and accepted. The women who made it were demonstrating skill and forethought. They were showing that they knew how to make something attractive, something that required time and attention. The fact that it was cold chicken and gelatin did not matter. What mattered was the presentation, the effort, the adherence to the standards of what a proper hostess served. Children were less impressed. Cold chicken was already a hard sell, and cold chicken and gelatin was worse. The texture was off-putting, the temperature was wrong, and the whole thing felt like it was pretending to be something it was not. If you were served jellied chicken loaf at a family gathering, you ate it slowly and politely, and you tried not to think too hard about what you were eating. The recipe stayed popular through the 1950s, peaked in the early 60s, and then disappeared. People stopped pretending that gelatin improved chicken. They stopped making molded salads and loaves and aspics. The whole category of jellied savory dishes collapsed, and jellied chicken loaf went with it. But if you sat at a table in 1947 and saw that glossy loaf sitting on a platter, you knew exactly what you were about to eat. and you knew you were going to eat it because that was what was served, and refusing would have been unthinkable. So you ate it, and you remembered it, and decades later, you still cannot quite believe that people thought it was a good idea. This was raw grated carrots mixed with raisins, mayonnaise, and sometimes a little sugar or lemon juice, served cold as a side dish. That was it. No lettuce, no other vegetables, just carrots, raisins, and mayonnaise in a bowl. It was sweet, crunchy, and appeared at nearly every potluck and church supper in the 1940s. The recipe was simple, required no cooking, and used ingredients that were usually on hand. It was not fancy. It was not particularly good. But it was easy, and easy mattered when you were feeding a crowd or trying to fill out a table. Carrot and raisin salad is still made occasionally, mostly by people who remember it from childhood and cannot quite explain why they still make it. Your mother grated the carrots by hand, using a box grater and working her way through 3 or 4 large carrots until her arm was tired. The grated carrots piled up in a bowl, bright orange and slightly damp. She added a handful of raisins, the dark ones that came in a red box, and sometimes she soaked them in warm water first to plump them up. Then came the mayonnaise, scooped straight from the jar. Enough to coat everything, but not so much that it became soupy. She stirred it together, and the orange carrots turned pale and creamy, streaked with dark raisins. Sometimes she added a spoonful of sugar to make it sweeter. Sometimes she added a squeeze of lemon juice to cut the richness of the mayonnaise. Sometimes she added both. Sometimes she added neither. The recipe was flexible, which was part of its appeal. You could make it with what you had, and it would turn out fine. Not great, not memorable, just fine. She served it in a bowl, set it on the table with the other dishes, and people spooned it onto their plates without comment. It was a side dish, something to fill space on the plate between the main course and the bread. You ate it with a fork, and the texture was crunchy from the raw carrots and chewy from the raisins. The flavor was sweet and slightly tangy from the mayonnaise, and the carrots tasted like carrots, which was to say they tasted like vegetables pretending to be part of a dessert. Carrot and raisin salad made sense in the 1940s because it was cheap, easy, and could be made in advance. Carrots were inexpensive and kept well. Raisins were shelf-stable and added sweetness without requiring sugar rations. Mayonnaise was a standard pantry item, used in everything from sandwiches to cakes. The salad required no cooking, no special equipment, and no particular skill. You could make it in 10 minutes and it would feed a crowd. The salad appeared at potlucks because it traveled well and did not need to be kept hot. You could make it in the morning, put it in a covered dish, and bring it to church or a neighbor's house without worrying about it spoiling or getting cold. It sat on the buffet table next to the casseroles and the Jell-O molds and the deviled eggs, and people took a spoonful because it was there and because taking a little of everything was what you did at a potluck. Children had mixed feelings about carrot and raisin salad. The sweetness was appealing, and the raisins were familiar. But the raw carrots were hard to chew, and the mayonnaise made it feel like something that should be a dessert, but was not quite sweet enough to qualify. If you liked carrots, you ate it without complaint. If you did not, you pushed it around your plate and hoped nobody noticed. The salad stayed on tables through the 1950s and 60s, appeared less frequently in the 70s, and mostly disappeared by the 80s. But it never fully went away. You can still find it at church potlucks in small towns, at family reunions in the Midwest, at covered dish suppers where the average age of the attendees is above 60. The people who make it now are usually the same people who ate it as children, and they make it out of habit or nostalgia or a sense that a potluck is not complete without it. The recipe has not changed. Grated carrots, raisins, mayonnaise, Sometimes sugar, sometimes lemon juice, sometimes neither. It is still simple, still easy, and still not particularly good. But it is also still there, quietly persisting, outlasting more ambitious recipes that tried harder and failed faster. Carrot and raisin salad never tried to be anything other than what it was. And maybe that is why it survived. Cottage cheese was mixed into lime or lemon gelatin along with canned pineapple, shredded carrots, or sometimes just left plain. The mixture was poured into a mold, chilled until firm, and served as a salad. The cottage cheese added protein and texture. The gelatin added structure and shine. The combination was considered light, refreshing, and appropriate for warm weather. It was not. It was cold, jiggly, and had an unsettling texture that made people eat it slowly while making careful conversation. Cottage cheese and gelatin molds appeared throughout the 1940s and 50s, peaked in popularity in the early 1960s, and then quietly disappeared, unmourned. Your mother made cottage cheese gelatin molds in the summer when the kitchen was too hot for baking and cold dishes seemed appropriate. She dissolved lime gelatin in boiling water, added cold water, and let it cool until it was slightly thickened. Then she folded in cottage cheese, the small curd kind that came in a carton from the dairy case. The cottage cheese did not dissolve or blend in smoothly. It sat in the gelatin like little white lumps, visible and distinct. She added crushed pineapple, drained but still damp, and sometimes shredded carrots for color. She poured the mixture into a ring mold, smoothed the top, and set it in the refrigerator to firm up. Hours later, she unmolded it onto a platter, running warm water over the outside of the mold and coaxing it to release. When it worked, the mold came out clean, a pale green ring studded with white curds and yellow pineapple. When it did not work, it came out in pieces, and she served it in a bowl instead and called it a salad. Either way, it ended up on the table, sitting on a bed of lettuce, with a serving spoon stuck in the center. You served yourself a portion, and it jiggled on your plate. The gelatin was firm, but not solid, and the cottage cheese made it lumpy. Each bite was a combination of cold, sweet gelatin and bland, slightly sour cottage cheese. The pineapple added a burst of sweetness, and the carrots added crunch, but neither could fully distract from the fundamental strangeness of the dish. It was a salad that was also a dessert, or maybe a dessert that was pretending to be a salad. The categories were unclear, and that ambiguity made it hard to know how to feel about it. Cottage cheese gelatin molds were considered healthful and modern. Cottage cheese was a diet food, low in fat and high in protein, recommended for weight loss and healthy eating. Gelatin was light and low in calories, and it made the cottage cheese more interesting, or at least more structured. The combination appeared in women's magazines under headlines about summer entertaining and light luncheons. It was presented as something elegant and sophisticated, something a modern hostess would serve. But the reality was less elegant than the photographs suggested. The molds looked better than they tasted, and the texture was off-putting. The cottage cheese remained cottage cheese, even when suspended in gelatin. It did not transform or blend in. It just sat there, lumpy and white, a reminder that you were eating something that was supposed to be good for you, rather than something you actually wanted to eat. The molds appeared at ladies' luncheons, where they were served in small portions on individual plates, garnished with a leaf of lettuce and a maraschino cherry. They appeared at potlucks, where they sat next to the other gelatin salads and competed for attention. They appeared at family dinners on hot summer evenings, when nobody wanted to turn on the stove, and cold food seemed like a reasonable solution. Children hated cottage cheese gelatin molds. The texture was wrong, the flavor was confusing, and the whole thing looked like something that had gone bad. If you were served a portion at a family gathering, you ate it slowly, taking the smallest possible bites, and tried to hide what was left under your lettuce leaf. Adults were more polite, but not necessarily more enthusiastic. They ate it because it was there, because refusing would have been rude, and because the person who made it was sitting right there watching. Cottage cheese gelatin molds disappeared in the late 1960s and early 70s, victims of changing tastes and a general realization that cottage cheese and gelatin did not need to be combined. The molds were forgotten quickly and thoroughly, and few people mourned their passing. But if you ate them, you remember them. You remember the pale green color, the lumpy texture, the way the cottage cheese refused to blend in. You remember eating it slowly, politely, while wishing you were eating something else, anything else. Deviled ham came in small cans with a distinctive red devil logo. It was finely ground ham mixed with spices, fat, and preservatives, spreadable like pâté, but cheaper and less refined. It was used for sandwiches, canapés, and stuffed celery. Deviled ham on white bread with a little lettuce was a standard lunch. The spread was salty, soft, and had a faint smoky flavor. It required no refrigeration before opening, which made it practical for packed lunches and picnics. Deviled ham was everywhere in the 1940s, sold in every grocery store, mentioned in every sandwich recipe collection. It still exists. Most people still do not buy it. Your mother kept a few cans of deviled ham in the pantry, lined up next to the tuna and the Spam. The cans were small, about the size of a fist, with a key attached to the bottom for opening. She peeled the key off, fitted it into the metal strip on the side, and wound it around the can, curling the metal back and exposing the contents. The deviled ham came out in a smooth pink paste, dense and spreadable. It smelled like ham and spices, salty and slightly sweet. She spread it on white bread, soft bread from the bakery or the grocery store, the kind that compressed under the knife. The deviled ham went on thick, covering the bread from edge to edge. Sometimes she added a leaf of iceberg lettuce. Sometimes she added a thin slice of tomato. Sometimes she added nothing, just deviled ham and bread, 2 slices pressed together to make a sandwich. She cut the sandwich in half diagonally, wrapped it in wax paper, and put it in a lunchbox or a paper bag. You ate it at lunchtime, unwrapping the sandwich and taking a bite. The bread was soft and bland. The deviled ham was salty and rich, and the texture was smooth and slightly greasy. The flavor was ham, but concentrated and spiced, with notes of paprika and maybe clove. It was not fresh ham. It was processed ham, ground fine and mixed with fat and preservatives, designed to last on a shelf for months without spoiling. But it tasted like ham, and that was enough. Deviled ham sandwiches were standard lunch fare. Your mother made them for your father's lunch pail, for your school lunch, for picnics and road trips. The sandwiches traveled well, did not need to be kept cold, and could sit in a lunchbox for hours without going bad. They were practical, reliable, and cheap. A single can of deviled ham could make 3 or 4 sandwiches, and the cans cost pennies. The spread was also used for more ambitious purposes. Your mother made deviled ham canapés for parties, spreading it on small rounds of bread or crackers and topping them with a slice of pickle or a sprig of parsley. She stuffed celery sticks with deviled ham and arranged them on a plate. She mixed it with cream cheese to make a dip, served with crackers and vegetables. Deviled ham was versatile, or at least it was presented that way in women's magazines and recipe pamphlets. But mostly it was lunch. Simple, plain, unremarkable lunch. You ate it without thinking too much about it, because lunch was something that happened every day and did not require enthusiasm. The sandwich filled you up, got you through the afternoon, and did not cost much. That was all it needed to do. Deviled ham is still sold today, in the same small cans with the same Red Devil logo. The formula has probably not changed much. It is still salty, still smooth, still shelf-stable. But most people walk past it in the grocery store without seeing it. It belongs to a different era, a time when canned meat spread on white bread was a normal lunch, not a nostalgic curiosity. If you ate it as a child, you probably have not eaten it since. But you remember it. You remember the smooth texture, the salty flavor, the way the bread got slightly damp from the spread. You remember your mother making sandwiches in the morning, wrapping them in wax paper, and sending you off with lunch in a brown bag. And if you think about it now, you can almost taste it. That particular combination of soft white bread and salty deviled ham that was lunch in 1946. This was cold-cooked rice mixed with whipped cream, canned pineapple, and maraschino cherries. Sometimes marshmallows were added. It was served as a dessert or a side dish, depending on who was serving it. Glorified rice appeared at potlucks and church suppers throughout the Midwest in the 1940s and 50s. The recipe was simple, used leftover rice, and looked festive because of the cherries. The texture was soft and creamy. The flavor was sweet and bland. It was called glorified because rice by itself was plain, and adding canned fruit and whipped cream made it special, or at least tried to. The name was aspirational. The reality was less so. Your mother made glorified rice the day after she made too much rice for dinner. She took the leftover rice, cold and slightly sticky, and broke it up with a fork. Then she whipped cream by hand in a bowl, beating it until it was thick and soft and held its shape. The whipped cream went into the rice, folding together until the rice was coated and pale. She added crushed pineapple, drained but still juicy, and chopped maraschino cherries, the bright red ones that came in a jar. Sometimes she added miniature marshmallows, the kind that were meant for hot chocolate, but worked just as well in desserts. She mixed it all together and put it in the refrigerator to chill. The rice absorbed some of the cream and softened further. The pineapple added sweetness and moisture. The cherries added color and a fake fruity flavor that tasted nothing like real cherries. The marshmallows stayed soft and chewy. When it was time to serve, she spooned it into small glass bowls or put it in a serving dish and let people help themselves. The texture was soft and creamy, almost pudding-like, but with the distinct graininess of rice. The flavor was sweet and mild, with the pineapple providing most of the taste and the cherries adding little bursts of artificial sweetness. It was cold, which made it seem refreshing, and the whipped cream made it feel indulgent, even though the main ingredient was leftover rice. The name glorified was supposed to elevate it, to suggest that something ordinary had been transformed into something special. And in a way, it had been. Rice by itself was just rice. But rice with whipped cream and canned fruit was dessert, or at least close enough. Glorified rice appeared at potlucks and church suppers because it was easy to make in large quantities, used ingredients that were usually on hand, and looked more impressive than it was. The bright red cherries made it festive, and the whipped cream made it look rich. People took a spoonful because it looked appealing, and they ate it because it was sweet and cold and inoffensive. It was not the best thing on the table, but it was also not the worst. It was just there, filling a spot on the dessert table next to the Jell-O molds and the sheet cakes. The question of whether glorified rice was a dessert or a side dish was never fully resolved. Some people served it as dessert, treating it like a pudding or a mousse. Others served it as a side dish, setting it on the table with the main course and letting people decide for themselves. The ambiguity was part of what made it strange. It was too sweet to be a side dish, but not quite sweet enough to be a proper dessert. It occupied a middle ground, a culinary limbo that made it hard to know how to feel about it. Children liked glorified rice more than adults did. The sweetness appealed to them, and the marshmallows and cherries made it fun. Adults were more skeptical, recognizing it for what it was: leftover rice dressed up with whipped cream and canned fruit. But they ate it anyway, because it was there, and because refusing dessert at a church supper was not something you did. Glorified rice is still made occasionally, mostly in the Midwest, mostly by older cooks who remember it from their childhood. It shows up at potlucks and family reunions, always in the same glass bowl, always with the same cherries on top. The younger generations look at it with confusion, unsure whether it is a salad or a dessert or something else entirely. The older generations eat it without question, because they have been eating it for 70 years and see no reason to stop now. The rice is still glorified, even if nobody can quite explain why it needed to be glorified in the first place. This was baked beans, straight from the can, heated and spread on white bread, sometimes with butter, sometimes with pickles, usually just beans and bread. It was fast, filling, and cost almost nothing. Baked bean sandwiches were common during the Depression and stayed common through the war and into the late 1940s. Beans were protein. Bread was filler. Together, they made a meal when there was not much else available. The sandwiches were soft, sweet, and slightly gritty from the beans. They were not elegant, but they were food, and food was the point, not elegance. Your mother opened a can of baked beans, dumped them into a small pot, and heated them on the stove. The beans bubbled and thickened, and the molasses sauce darkened and became stickier. When they were hot, she spooned them onto slices of white bread, the soft kind that compressed under the weight of the beans. Sometimes she buttered the bread first. Sometimes she did not. Sometimes she put another slice of bread on top to make a closed sandwich. Sometimes she left it open and ate it with a fork. The beans were sweet and smoky, flavored with molasses and maybe a little pork fat. They were soft and tender, and they broke apart easily when you bit into them. The bread soaked up the sauce, becoming damp and slightly sweet, and the combination was filling in a heavy, starchy way. The sandwich was not complicated. It was not interesting. It was just beans and bread, two cheap ingredients combined to make something that counted as a meal. Baked bean sandwiches were Depression food, war food, poverty food. They were what you ate when the grocery budget was empty and the cupboard was nearly bare. A can of beans cost a nickel. A loaf of bread cost a dime. Together, they could feed a family for 2 days. It was not glamorous, but it was effective. The sandwiches filled you up, gave you energy, and required almost no effort to make. Your mother made baked bean sandwiches on the days when money was tight and the next paycheck was still a few days away. She made them when the meat ration had run out and there was nothing else to put on the table. She made them when it was late and everyone was tired and nobody had the energy to cook something complicated. The sandwiches were a fallback, a safety net, proof that you could make a meal out of almost nothing. Children had mixed feelings about baked bean sandwiches. The sweetness was appealing, and the beans were soft and easy to eat. But the texture was mushy, and the sandwich fell apart easily, leaving bean sauce on your hands and face. If you were hungry, you ate it without complaint. If you were not particularly hungry, you ate it slowly, taking small bites, and wished you were eating something else. Adults ate baked bean sandwiches without comment. They were practical, economical, and got the job done. Nobody pretended they were delicious. Nobody served them at dinner parties or church suppers. They were private food, home food, the kind of thing you ate when nobody was watching and nobody needed to be impressed. They were survival food, and survival did not require enthusiasm. Baked bean sandwiches mostly disappeared after the 1950s, as the economy improved and people had more options. But they never fully went away. You can still find them in working-class households, in rural areas where money is tight and waste is not tolerated, in places where the memory of the Depression is still vivid enough to shape how people eat. The sandwiches are still simple, still cheap, still filling, and for the people who eat them, that is still enough. If you ate baked bean sandwiches as a child, you remember them clearly. The soft bread, the sweet beans, the way the sauce soaked through and made everything damp. You remember eating them quickly, without ceremony, and then moving on with your day. They were not memorable in the way a birthday cake was memorable. They were memorable in the way that hardship is memorable, as evidence of a time when making do was not optional but necessary. And if you think about them now, you probably do not miss them. But you remember them, and that memory carries weight. Scrapple was a loaf made from pork scraps, cornmeal, and spices, cooked together, poured into a mold, chilled until solid, then sliced and fried. It was gray-brown, crispy on the outside, soft on the inside, and used every part of the pig that did not go into sausage or roasts. Scrapple was regional, mostly Pennsylvania and the Mid-Atlantic, but it appeared in 1940s cookbooks as an example of frugal, practical cooking. It was served for breakfast with eggs and toast. The flavor was savory and porky. The texture was dense. The appeal was economic. Scrapple embodied a principle that was central to 1940s cooking. Waste nothing, use everything, and make it taste good enough that people will eat it. Your mother made scrapple on butchering day, or the day after, when there were scraps and trimmings and bits of meat that did not fit anywhere else. She boiled the scraps with the bones, making a rich broth, then picked the meat off and chopped it fine. The broth went back on the stove, and she stirred in cornmeal gradually, whisking it to prevent lumps. The mixture thickened into a heavy porridge, and she added the chopped meat back in, along with salt, pepper, sage, and maybe a little thyme. She cooked it all together until it was thick and smooth, then poured it into a loaf pan and set it in a cool place to firm up. The next morning, or the next week, she sliced the loaf into half-inch slabs and fried them in a hot skillet. The outside crisped up and turned brown, and the inside stayed soft and dense. The smell that filled the kitchen was pork and cornmeal and spices, savory and slightly sweet. She served the scrapple with eggs, fried in the same pan, and toast, and that was breakfast. The scrapple was crispy on the outside, soft and crumbly on the inside, and tasted like concentrated pork, porky and rich. You ate it with a fork, cutting through the crispy crust and scooping up the soft interior. The flavor was strong and savory, and the texture was somewhere between sausage and polenta. It was filling, heavy, and lasted you through the morning. Scrapple was not delicate. It was not refined, but it was effective, and effectiveness was the point. Scrapple was regional, most common in Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and parts of New Jersey. It came from German immigrant traditions, the same traditions that gave America sauerkraut and pretzels and shoofly pie. The principle behind scrapple was simple. Use everything, waste nothing, make it taste good. After butchering, you had scraps and trimmings that were too small for roasts or sausages, but too good to throw away. Scrapple was the solution. You cooked the scraps, mixed them with cornmeal to stretch them further, seasoned them well, and turned them into something you could slice and fry. It was practical, economical, and respectful of the animal. The recipe appeared in 1940s cookbooks, not as a regional curiosity, but as an example of good household management. Home economists praised it. Frugal living guides recommended it. It was held up as a model of how to feed a family without wasting anything. Scrapple did not require fancy ingredients or special equipment. It just required scraps, cornmeal, and the willingness to turn something ordinary into something edible. Children had mixed feelings about scrapple. The flavor was strong, the texture was strange, and the name itself suggested something made from scraps, which was not appealing. But if you grew up eating it, it became normal. It was breakfast, the same way bacon or sausage was breakfast in other households. You ate it with eggs and toast, and it gave you energy for the day, and that was all it needed to do. Scrapple is still made today, mostly in the regions where it has always been made. You can buy it in grocery stores in Pennsylvania and Maryland, sold in loaves wrapped in plastic, sitting in the refrigerator case next to the bacon and sausage. Some people still make it at home, following recipes handed down from grandmothers and great-grandmothers. The process has not changed. The ingredients have not changed. It is still scraps and cornmeal and spices, cooked together and fried. And it is still a reminder that the best cooking often comes from necessity, from the need to use what you have and waste nothing. Scrapple was never trying to be fancy. It was just trying to be food. And in that modest goal, it succeeded completely. This was a frozen dessert made with crushed strawberries, cream cheese, mayonnaise, whipped cream, and sometimes marshmallows. The mixture was frozen in a loaf pan, sliced, and served on lettuce leaves as a salad or dessert. The combination of mayonnaise and strawberries sounds insane now, but mayonnaise was used in many 1940s desserts as a fat substitute. Pink Arctic Freeze appeared in women's magazines and community cookbooks, usually in the summer section. It was cold, creamy, pink, and sweet. The mayonnaise flavor was not obvious. The dessert was popular at bridge parties and ladies' luncheons. It has not survived. Your mother made Pink Arctic Freeze the day before a luncheon or party because it needed time to freeze solid. She started with a package of frozen strawberries, thawed and crushed, or fresh strawberries if it was summer and they were in season. The strawberries went into a bowl with softened cream cheese, and she beat them together until they were smooth and pink. Then came the mayonnaise, a few tablespoons, stirred in carefully. The mayonnaise added richness and body, and because it was mostly oil and eggs, it behaved like a fat in the mixture, making it creamy and smooth. She whipped cream until it was thick and fluffy, then folded it into the strawberry mixture. Sometimes she added miniature marshmallows, the kind that stayed soft even when frozen. The mixture turned pale pink and airy, and she poured it into a loaf pan, smoothed the top, and put it in the freezer. It took several hours to freeze completely, and once it was solid, she could slice it like ice cream or a frozen loaf cake. When it was time to serve, she took the pan out of the freezer, ran a knife around the edges, and turned the loaf out onto a cutting board. She sliced it into thick pieces about an inch wide and placed each slice on a lettuce leaf on a small plate. The frozen dessert was pale pink, smooth, and studded with bits of strawberry and marshmallow. It looked elegant and refreshing, like something from a tea room or a fancy restaurant. You ate it with a fork, and the first bite was cold and creamy and sweet. The strawberries provided most of the flavor, bright and fruity, and the cream cheese added tang and richness. The whipped cream made it light and airy, almost mousse-like, and the marshmallows added little pockets of chewiness. The mayonnaise was invisible. You could not taste it. It was there in the texture, in the creaminess, and the way the dessert held together. But the flavor was completely masked by the strawberries and cream cheese. Pink Arctic Freeze was served at ladies' luncheons, bridge parties, and bridal showers. It was considered sophisticated and modern, a frozen dessert that was not ice cream, something special that required planning and forethought. The fact that it contained mayonnaise was not hidden exactly, but it was not advertised either. The recipe cards and magazine articles mentioned it matter-of-factly, as if using mayonnaise in a frozen strawberry dessert was the most natural thing in the world. and in the 1940s it was. Mayonnaise was used in cakes, cookies, salads, and frozen desserts. It was a versatile ingredient, and nobody questioned it. Children were less enthusiastic about pink Arctic Freeze than adults. It was served on lettuce, which made it seem like a salad, and salads were not dessert. The frozen texture was strange, harder than ice cream, but softer than a popsicle. And if you knew there was mayonnaise in it, the knowledge was unsettling, even if you could not taste it. But adults ate it happily, praising its lightness and refreshing quality, and asking for the recipe. The dessert disappeared sometime in the 1960s or 70s, a casualty of changing tastes and a growing suspicion of mayonnaise in desserts. People stopped pretending that mayonnaise belonged in frozen strawberry concoctions, and pink Arctic Freeze quietly disappeared from recipe boxes and community cookbooks. It is almost never made today, and when it is as a nostalgic curiosity, a relic of a time when food rules were different, and mayonnaise was a miracle ingredient that could be used in anything. But if you ate it in 1948, sitting at a luncheon table with a slice of pink frozen dessert on a lettuce leaf in front of you, you remember how it tasted. Cold, sweet, creamy, and slightly mysterious. And you remember thinking it was delicious, even if you could never quite figure out why. City chicken was not chicken. It was cubes of pork and veal threaded onto wooden skewers, breaded and fried or baked. The skewers made it look like chicken drumsticks. The name came from urban areas during the Depression and war years, when chicken was expensive and pork and veal were cheaper. City chicken remained popular through the 1940s, especially in the Midwest and Northeast. The meat was tender, the breading was crispy, and the presentation made it feel more special than it was. The recipe was practical and economical. The name was misleading, and the dish was forgotten once chicken became affordable again. Your mother bought pork shoulder and veal from the butcher, already cut into cubes, or she bought larger pieces and cut them herself. The cubes were about an inch square, and she threaded them onto wooden skewers, alternating pork and veal. 3 or 4 pieces per skewer. The skewers looked like little drumsticks, and that was the point. She seasoned the meat with salt and pepper, dipped each skewer in beaten egg, then rolled it in breadcrumbs until it was completely coated. The breading stuck to the meat, and the skewers went into a hot skillet with a little oil. She fried them until the breading was golden and crispy, turning them carefully so they browned on all sides. Sometimes she finished them in the oven, covering the skillet and letting them bake until the meat was tender and cooked through. The breading stayed crispy on the outside, and the meat inside was soft and juicy. The smell that filled the kitchen was fried breading and pork and veal, savory and rich. She served the city chicken on a platter, arranged like drumsticks, and you picked them up by the skewer and ate them with your hands. The breading crunched when you bit into it, and the meat was tender and mild. The pork was slightly sweet, the veal was delicate, and together they tasted like something between pork chops and chicken, which was probably the idea. The skewers made it feel fun and special, like something you would eat at a fair or a picnic, even though you were eating it at the dinner table on a Tuesday night. City chicken was born out of economic necessity. During the Depression and through the war years, chicken was expensive. A whole chicken cost more than most families could afford to spend on a single meal. But pork and veal were cheaper, especially the cuts that were not as desirable, like shoulder and stew meat. Butchers and home cooks figured out that if you cut the meat into cubes, threaded it onto skewers, and breaded it, you could make it look and feel like chicken drumsticks, even if it tasted nothing like chicken. The name city chicken came from urban areas where the dish was most common, places where people were far from farms and had to make do with what was available at the butcher shop. The recipe stayed popular through the 1940s because it was economical and because people were used to it. The meat was inexpensive, the breading stretched it further, and the presentation made it feel like a treat. Children liked it because they could pick it up and eat it with their hands. Adults liked it because it was cheap and filling and looked more impressive than it was. City chicken was served at dinner tables across the Midwest and Northeast in working-class neighborhoods where economy mattered and chicken was still out of reach. But as chicken became more affordable in the 1950s and 60s, city chicken disappeared. There was no reason to make fake chicken drumsticks out of pork and veal when you could buy real chicken for the same price or less. The recipe faded from cookbooks and kitchen tables, and by the 1970s it was mostly forgotten. A few families kept making it out of tradition or nostalgia, but for most people, city chicken became a memory, a relic of a time when chicken was too expensive and pork was the practical alternative. If you ate city chicken as a child, you remember the skewers, the crispy breading, the way you could pick them up and eat them with your hands. You remember thinking they looked like drumsticks, but tasted different, something richer and more complex than chicken. And you remember your mother making them on weeknights, when money was tight and creativity was required, turning cheap cuts of meat into something that felt special. City chicken was never trying to fool anyone. Everyone knew it was not chicken. But it was called chicken anyway, because the name made it feel a little better, a little more festive, a little more like something worth eating. And in 1946, that mattered. Butter was rationed. Lard was not. Lard was rendered pork fat, kept in a can or crock in the pantry, and used for everything. Frying, baking, greasing pans, making pie crusts. Lard made the flakiest crusts, the crispiest fried chicken, and the tenderest biscuits. It was cheap, stable at room temperature, and produced reliably good results. Most 1940s kitchens had a can of lard near the stove. Bakers preferred it for pastry. Home cooks used it because butter was either unavailable or saved for the table. Lard fell out of favor in the 1980s and 90s when saturated fats were demonized. It has quietly returned to some kitchens now, appreciated for what it always was, effective, traditional, and unpretentious. Your mother kept a metal can of lard in the cupboard next to the flour and sugar. The can was white with blue lettering, and inside was pure white fat, smooth and firm at room temperature. She scooped it out with a spoon when she needed it, and it melted quickly in the heat of a pan, or when rubbed between her fingers. Lard did not have much smell, just a faint pork scent that disappeared when it was heated. It was neutral, practical, and reliable. She used lard for frying chicken, pork chops, fish, potatoes. She heated a few spoonfuls in a cast-iron skillet until it shimmered, then added the food and fried it until it was golden and crispy. The lard got hot without smoking, and it gave everything a crisp, even crust. Fried chicken made with lard was crispier than fried chicken made with any other fat. The coating stayed crunchy, and the meat inside stayed juicy. The lard did its job without adding much flavor of its own, which was what made it useful. She used lard for baking. Pie crusts, biscuits, cookies. Lard made the flakiest pie crusts, better than butter, better than shortening. She cut cold lard into flour with a pastry cutter or her fingers, working it until the mixture looked like coarse crumbs, then added just enough water to bring it together. The dough was tender and easy to roll, and when it baked, it puffed and flaked and melted in your mouth. Biscuits made with lard were soft and light, with layers that pulled apart easily. Cookies made with lard were tender and crumbly, with a delicate texture that butter could not quite replicate. She used lard for greasing pans, cake pans, bread pans, muffin tins. She rubbed a little lard on the inside of the pan with a piece of wax paper or her fingers, and nothing stuck. The lard was better than butter for this purpose, because it did not burn as easily, and it was better than oil because it stayed in place instead of running down the sides of the pan. Lard was everywhere in the 1940s because butter was rationed and vegetable shortening was not yet dominant. Lard was cheap, available, and effective. It did not require refrigeration before opening, which made it practical for pantries without ice boxes. It lasted for months without going rancid, especially if it was kept in a cool, dark place. And it worked for everything, which meant you only needed one fat instead of 3 or 4. But lard also carried associations that butter did not. It was working class. It was rural. It was the fat you used when you could not afford better. Butter was for the table, for spreading on bread, for special occasions. Lard was for cooking, for the everyday work of feeding a family. Nobody served lard at the table. Nobody praised it or celebrated it. It was just there, doing its job quietly and without fanfare. Lard fell out of favor in the 1980s and 90s when saturated fats were blamed for heart disease and obesity. Vegetable oils and shortenings were promoted as healthier alternatives, and lard was demonized as old-fashioned and unhealthy. People stopped using it, stopped buying it, and stopped teaching their children how to cook with it. Lard disappeared from most kitchens, replaced by oils and butter and margarine. But in recent years, lard has quietly returned. Bakers rediscovered that it makes the best pie crusts. Chefs rediscovered that it makes the best fried chicken. Home cooks rediscovered that it is a traditional, minimally processed fat that has been used for centuries. Lard is no longer seen as old-fashioned or inferior. It is seen as authentic, traditional, and effective. It is appreciated for what it always was, a simple fat that does its job well. If you grew up in a kitchen in the 1940s, you remember the can of lard in the cupboard. You remember your mother scooping it out, melting it in a pan, using it to fry chicken or make biscuits or grease a cake pan. You remember that it was just there, unremarkable and essential, the fat that made everything work. And if you think about it now, you realize that lard was never the problem. It was just a fat doing what fat does, making food taste good and cook well. And that is worth remembering. Adding a raw egg to a milkshake was standard in the 1940s. The egg added protein, richness, and made the shake thicker and more filling. Soda fountains and drugstore counters offered egg milkshakes as health drinks. The egg was beaten into the milk and ice cream, and the result was frothy and substantial. Nobody worried about salmonella. Eggs were considered wholesome and safe. Milkshakes with raw eggs were given to children, athletes, and anyone who needed to gain weight or recover from illness. The practice continued into the 1950s and 60s, then disappeared as food safety awareness increased and protein powders became available. You walked into the drugstore on a Saturday afternoon, slid onto a stool at the soda fountain, and ordered a chocolate milkshake. The soda jerk cracked an egg into the metal mixing cup without asking if you wanted it. It was just part of what a milkshake was. He added a scoop of vanilla ice cream, chocolate syrup, and cold milk, then fitted the cup onto the mixer and let it run until everything was blended smooth and frothy. The egg disappeared completely into the mixture, invisible but present, adding body and richness that made the shake thicker and more satisfying. He poured the shake into a tall glass, set it in front of you with a straw and a long spoon, and maybe left the metal cup on the counter so you could pour yourself more. The shake was cold and thick, almost too thick to pull through the straw, and the flavor was rich and chocolatey. The egg added a creaminess that plain ice cream and milk could not quite achieve on their own. It made the shake feel substantial, more like a meal than a treat. You drank it slowly, using the straw and the spoon, and when you were finished, you felt full in a way that lasted. Egg milkshakes were considered health drinks, something that was good for you as well as delicious. Doctors recommended them for children who needed to gain weight, for athletes who needed extra protein, for people recovering from illness or surgery. The egg was wholesome, natural, packed with nutrients. Nobody questioned it. Nobody worried about raw eggs making you sick. Food safety concerns were different then. Eggs came from local farms, were handled carefully, and were eaten raw in all kinds of preparations without incident. Eggnog, Caesar salad dressing, mayonnaise, hollandaise sauce, and milkshakes all used raw eggs, and nobody thought twice about it. The practice was so common that some households made egg milkshakes at home. Your mother would crack an egg into a jar with milk, sugar, and vanilla, screw the lid on tight, and shake it until it was frothy. It was not as smooth as a soda fountain shake, but it was close enough, and it used ingredients she already had in the kitchen. She gave it to you as an after-school snack, something to build you up, to keep you strong and healthy. The egg was medicine disguised as a treat, and you drank it without complaint because it tasted good. Soda fountains promoted egg milkshakes explicitly. The signs behind the counter advertised malts, shakes, and egg shakes, listing them as separate categories. Some places offered double egg shakes for people who needed extra nutrition. Athletes ordered them after practice. Teenagers ordered them on dates. Children ordered them because they were allowed to, because milkshakes were a normal part of childhood, and the egg just made them better. The practice started to fade in the 1970s and 80s as awareness of salmonella increased. Health departments began warning against raw eggs in restaurants. Soda fountains stopped adding them automatically. People stopped making egg milkshakes at home. Protein powders and nutritional supplements offered a safer alternative for people who wanted extra protein, and the raw egg fell out of favor. By the 1990s, the idea of putting a raw egg in a milkshake seemed risky, old-fashioned, and slightly reckless. But if you drank egg milkshakes as a child in the 1940s, you remember them clearly. The thick, rich texture, the way they filled you up and kept you satisfied for hours. The fact that they were good for you made them taste even better, as if the egg added something virtuous to the pleasure of drinking a milkshake. You remember sitting at the soda fountain counter, watching the soda jerk crack the egg into the cup, and feeling like you were getting something special, something more than just ice cream and milk. And you were. You were getting a milkshake the way milkshakes used to be, before food safety changed the rules, and eggs became something to be feared rather than celebrated. Cabbage was cheap, filling, and available year-round. Cabbage rolls combined boiled cabbage leaves wrapped around a filling of ground meat, rice, onions, and tomato sauce, then baked. The dish was labor-intensive but economical. One head of cabbage could make a dozen rolls. A pound of ground beef could be stretched with rice to feed a family. Cabbage rolls appeared in 1940s cookbooks and church recipe collections, especially in communities with Eastern European roots. The rolls were soft, savory, and filling. They were served with more tomato sauce, sometimes with sour cream. The recipe was practical, traditional, and tasted better than it sounded. Your mother made cabbage rolls on a weekend when she had time to spend in the kitchen. She started with a large head of cabbage, cored it carefully, and lowered it into a pot of boiling water. The outer leaves softened and loosened, and she peeled them away one by one, setting them aside to drain. When she had a dozen large leaves, she set the rest of the cabbage aside for soup or coleslaw. The leaves were pale green and tender, flexible enough to roll without tearing. She made the filling while the leaves cooled. Ground beef, uncooked white rice, minced onion, salt, pepper, and maybe a little garlic or paprika. She mixed it with her hands until everything was combined, then set it aside. Each cabbage leaf got a spoonful of filling placed near the stem end. She folded the sides in, rolled it up tight, and secured it with a toothpick if needed. The rolls went into a baking dish, packed snugly side by side, all facing the same direction. She made a simple tomato sauce, or used canned tomato sauce thinned with a little water, and poured it over the rolls until they were covered. The dish went into the oven, covered with foil, and baked slowly for an hour or more. During that time, the rice cooked inside the rolls, the cabbage softened further, and the meat became tender. The sauce bubbled and thickened, and the kitchen filled with the smell of tomato and cabbage and cooked meat, savory and slightly sweet. When the rolls were done, she lifted the foil and the steam rose up. The cabbage leaves were translucent and soft. The sauce was thick and dark, and the rolls had shrunk slightly but held their shape. She served them on plates, 2 or 3 rolls per person, with extra sauce spooned over the top. Sometimes she added a dollop of sour cream on the side, the cold tanginess cutting through the rich tomato flavor. You ate them with a fork and knife, cutting through the tender cabbage and releasing the filling inside. The rice was soft and had absorbed the flavors of the meat and the sauce. The beef was savory and mild. The cabbage was sweet and slightly earthy, and it held everything together without overpowering the other flavors. The sauce tied it all together, adding acidity and moisture to every bite. Cabbage rolls were filling and comforting, the kind of food that stuck to your ribs and kept you full for hours. Cabbage rolls were common in households with Eastern European heritage, Polish, Ukrainian, German, Czech. The recipe had been handed down through generations, and every family had their own version. Some added sausage to the filling. Some used sauerkraut instead of fresh cabbage. Some made a sweet and sour sauce with brown sugar and vinegar. But the basic principle was the same. Cabbage leaves wrapped around a filling of meat and rice, baked in tomato sauce until tender. The dish appeared at church suppers and community gatherings, usually made by the older women who remembered the recipe from their mothers and grandmothers. The rolls were served from large baking pans, still hot, with the sauce pooling around them. People took 1 or 2 rolls, piled their plates with other dishes, and found a seat. Cabbage rolls were not flashy or impressive, but they were dependable and satisfying, the kind of food that felt like home. The recipe stayed in circulation through the 1950s and 60s, appeared less frequently in the 70s and 80s, but never fully disappeared. Cabbage rolls are still made today, mostly in communities where the tradition has been maintained, where grandmothers still teach their granddaughters how to roll them properly and how to make the sauce from scratch. The recipe has not changed much. Cabbage, meat, rice, tomato sauce. The same ingredients, the same method, the same result. And if you ate them in 1946, sitting at a table with your family, the rolls hot and steaming on your plate, you remember how they tasted. Soft, savory, filling. And you remember that they were made with time and care, which was the whole point. Dandelion greens were foraged, not bought. They grew in yards and fields, free for the picking, especially in spring. The greens were young, tender, and slightly bitter. They were boiled or sautéed with bacon fat and vinegar, then served as a side dish. Dandelion greens were common in the 1940s, especially in rural areas and among families with European roots. They were nutritious, required no money, and connected people to older food traditions. Picking dandelions from the yard was normal. Eating weeds was practical. And the practice continued until lawns became chemically treated and foraging became inconvenient. You went out into the yard in early spring, before the dandelions had gone to seed, and picked the leaves close to the ground. The young greens were the best, tender and only slightly bitter, before they toughened and turned harsh. You filled a basket or a bag, pulling the leaves carefully to avoid the roots, and brought them inside to wash. Your mother rinsed them several times, checking for dirt and bugs, then drained them and set them aside. She heated bacon fat in a large skillet, the fat left over from breakfast or saved in a jar by the stove. The fat melted and shimmered, and she added the damp dandelion greens all at once. They sizzled and wilted immediately, shrinking down to a fraction of their raw volume. She stirred them with a wooden spoon, cooking them until they were completely wilted and tender. Then she added a splash of vinegar, usually cider vinegar, and a pinch of salt. The vinegar cut through the bitterness and added a sharp, bright flavor that made the greens more palatable. She served them hot, piled on a plate, with the bacon fat and vinegar pooling at the bottom. You ate them with a fork, and the flavor was strong and green, earthy and slightly bitter, tempered by the richness of the bacon fat and the acidity of the vinegar. Dandelion greens were an acquired taste, something you learned to appreciate rather than something you loved immediately. Children were less enthusiastic than adults, but they ate them anyway, because that was what was for dinner, and refusing vegetables was not an option. Dandelion greens were free, which made them valuable in households where every penny mattered. They were also nutritious, high in vitamins and minerals, and they appeared in early spring when winter stores were running low and fresh vegetables were not yet available from the garden. Picking dandelions was practical foraging, a way to supplement the table without spending money. Your mother knew which yards had the best greens, which fields were safe to pick from, and when the leaves were at their peak. She picked them several times a season, always in the spring before they got too bitter, and served them as often as people would tolerate. The tradition of eating dandelion greens was strongest in communities with Italian, German, or Eastern European roots, places where foraging and using wild plants was part of the food culture. But it spread beyond those communities during the Depression and the war, when making do and using what was available became universal necessities. Dandelion greens were a Depression food that persisted into the 1940s and 50s. Not because people loved them, but because they were there and they were free. The practice started to fade in the 1960s and 70s as lawns became chemically treated and people became more suspicious of eating things from the yard. Herbicides and pesticides made foraging unsafe, and the cultural shift away from poverty foods made dandelion greens seem old-fashioned and embarrassing. People stopped picking them, stopped cooking them, and stopped passing the tradition down to their children. By the 1980s, eating dandelion greens was rare, a curiosity practiced by a few holdouts who remembered when it was normal. But the greens have come back in recent years, rebranded as foraged food, local food, sustainable food. Farmers markets sell them. Restaurants serve them in salads and sautés. People who would never have eaten dandelions in the 1940s now seek them out as something special and authentic. The greens have been reclaimed, their bitterness appreciated rather than tolerated, their connection to the land celebrated rather than hidden. If you picked dandelion greens from the yard in 1946, you remember the basket full of jagged leaves, the smell of bacon fat in the skillet, the sharp bite of vinegar cutting through the bitterness. You remember that they were free, which mattered, and nutritious, which also mattered. And you remember that eating them connected you to something older, something that had nothing to do with grocery stores or money, something that came straight from the ground and onto your plate. That kind of direct connection is harder to find now, but in the 1940s, it was just part of how you ate. Oyster stew was a Christmas Eve tradition in many American households through the 1940s. Fresh or canned oysters simmered in milk or cream with butter, salt, and pepper. Served hot with oyster crackers. The stew was simple, rich, and required little preparation. Oysters were more affordable then, especially canned oysters, which could be kept on the shelf and used when needed. Oyster stew was served before midnight mass or as a late supper after church. The tradition was regional but widespread, appearing in Catholic and Protestant households, urban and rural kitchens. The stew was mild, creamy, and tasted like the ocean. It was something special in the middle of winter. Your mother made oyster stew on Christmas Eve, after the tree was decorated and the presents were wrapped and the house was clean. She opened a can of oysters, or if your father had brought home fresh ones from the market, she used those. The oysters were small and gray, swimming in their own liquid, and she poured them into a saucepan. She added milk, whole milk from the dairy, and a generous lump of butter. Salt, pepper, and nothing else. The stew did not need anything else. She heated it slowly, stirring occasionally until the butter melted and the milk was hot, and the edges of the oysters curled slightly. The stew was ready when it was steaming, but not boiling. Boiling would toughen the oysters and curdle the milk, so she watched it carefully and pulled it off the heat at just the right moment. She ladled it into bowls, the oysters bobbing in the creamy broth, and set them on the table with a basket of oyster crackers on the side. You ate it sitting at the kitchen table, the house quiet except for the sound of spoons against bowls. The stew was rich and mild, tasting like milk and butter and the sea. The oysters were soft and slightly chewy, briny but not overwhelmingly so. You floated oyster crackers in the broth, and they softened and absorbed the liquid, and you scooped them up with your spoon. The stew was simple, but it felt ceremonial, something you ate only once a year, only on this night. Oyster stew on Christmas Eve was a tradition that went back generations. It appeared in Irish Catholic families, German Protestant families, New England fishing families, Midwestern farm families. The reasons for the tradition varied. Some said it was because oysters were abundant in winter. Some said it was because Christmas Eve was a fasting day and oysters did not count as meat. Some said it was simply because oyster stew was special, something different from everyday food, and Christmas Eve deserved something special. The stew was often served before midnight mass, eaten quickly so the family could get to church on time. Or it was served after mass, late at night, when everyone came home cold and tired and needed something warm and filling before bed. The stew was fast to make, which mattered when the evening was already full of church and family and Christmas preparations. Your mother could have it on the table in 15 minutes, and it felt like a proper meal, even though it was just oysters and milk. Canned oysters made the tradition accessible to families far from the coast. A can of oysters cost less than $1 and could feed 4 people when stretched with enough milk. Fresh oysters were better, more flavorful and tender, but canned oysters were reliable and convenient. They sat on the pantry shelf all year, waiting for Christmas Eve, and when the time came, they were there. The tradition started to fade in the 1960s and 70s as oyster prices increased, and younger generations rejected the foods their parents ate. Oyster stew seemed old-fashioned, plain, and unappealing to children who wanted pizza and hamburgers. Families stopped making it, stopped serving it, and stopped passing the tradition down. By the 1980s, oyster stew on Christmas Eve was rare, practiced only in households where the older generation insisted on maintaining it. But some families never stopped. They still make oyster stew every Christmas Eve, using the same recipe their grandmothers used, serving it in the same bowls. The stew is still simple, still mild, still rich. And it still tastes like Christmas Eve in 1946. When the tree was lit and the house was warm and everyone sat down together for a bowl of hot, creamy oyster stew before heading out into the cold winter night for church. Sunday pot roast was the center of the week. A cheap cut of beef, browned and slow-cooked with potatoes, carrots, and onions in a covered pot for hours. The meat became tender. The vegetables absorbed the flavor. The house smelled like dinner from noon onward. Pot roast was served after church in the early afternoon with bread and butter. It was reliable, filling, and required more time than skill. The recipe was handed down, adjusted slightly, but never fundamentally changed. Pot roast was what you ate on Sunday. It was what your mother ate on Sunday. It was what your grandmother ate on Sunday. The repetition was the point. Pot roast was not about surprise or innovation. It was about showing up, feeding people, and marking the day as different from the others. Your mother started the pot roast before church. She took a chuck roast, a tough cheap cut from the shoulder, and rubbed it with salt and pepper. She heated oil in a heavy pot, a Dutch oven or a cast iron pot with a lid, and browned the meat on all sides. The meat sizzled and darkened, and the smell filled the kitchen. When it was browned, she set it aside and added onions to the pot, letting them soften in the drippings. Then she put the meat back in, added water or beef broth until it came halfway up the sides, covered the pot tightly, and slid it into the oven. The pot roast cooked slowly while you were at church, the heat low and steady, the liquid barely simmering. When you came home, the house smelled like meat and onions, rich and savory, and you knew dinner was almost ready. Your mother added potatoes and carrots to the pot, chunks of vegetables that would cook in the last hour, absorbing the flavor of the meat and the gravy. She covered it again and let it finish while she changed out of her church clothes and set the table. By early afternoon, the pot roast was ready. Your mother lifted the lid and the steam rose up, carrying the smell of beef and vegetables and slow-cooked gravy. The meat was so tender it fell apart when she lifted it with a fork. The vegetables were soft and sweet, and the gravy was thick and dark, concentrated from hours of cooking. She arranged everything on a platter, the meat in the center, the vegetables around the edges, and brought it to the table. You ate it slowly, cutting the meat with the side of your fork because it did not need a knife. The beef was rich and savory, and the gravy soaked into the potatoes and carrots, making everything taste like the roast. You had bread to soak up the extra gravy, butter to spread on the bread, and that was Sunday dinner. Simple, satisfying, exactly what you expected. Pot roast on Sunday was a ritual that structured the week. Saturday was chores and errands. Sunday was church and pot roast. The meal was the same every week, or close enough that the variations did not matter. The predictability was the point. You knew what you were having for dinner on Sunday, and that knowledge was comforting. It meant the week had a shape, a rhythm, a beginning, and an end. The recipe was passed down through generations, mother to daughter, with small adjustments but no major changes. Your mother made pot roast the way her mother had made it, and her mother had made it the way her grandmother had made it. The recipe was not written down because it did not need to be. You browned the meat, added liquid, cooked it slowly, added vegetables at the end. That was all. The details varied, but the principle was constant. Pot roast required time, which was what made it Sunday food. You could not make it on a weeknight when you got home from work at 6 and needed dinner on the table by 7. But on Sunday, when you had the morning for church and the afternoon for rest, pot roast fit perfectly. You started it early, let it cook while you did other things, and by the time you were hungry, it was ready. The slowness was not an inconvenience. It was part of the rhythm of the day. Sunday pot roast is still made today, though less often than it was in the 1940s. Families are busier, schedules are less predictable, and the idea of spending all day Sunday at home is less common. But some families still do it. They still put a pot roast in the oven on Sunday morning, still come home to the smell of slow-cooked beef, still sit down together in the early afternoon to eat it. And when they do, they are connecting to something that goes back generations, a ritual that is about more than just food. It is about time, about repetition, about the quiet satisfaction of doing the same thing the same way every week, because that is what Sunday is for. Pot roast was never trying to be exciting. It was just trying to be Sunday. And that was always enough. It is quiet now. The kitchen from 1946 has faded. The victory cake has been eaten. The liver loaf has been forgotten. The gelatin molds have melted back into memory. Your mother has set down her spoon and stepped away from the stove, and the recipes that filled her days have become stories, fragments, things that sound impossible until you remember they were real. These recipes were not mistakes. They were solutions. They were what people did when butter was rationed and meat was scarce, and making something from nothing was not a skill you cultivated for fun, but a requirement for getting through the week. The food was strange by current standards, yes. Cottage cheese and gelatin, Spam with pineapple, crackers pretending to be apples. But it was also practical, creative, and surprisingly effective. People ate it. Families were fed. Life went on. What we lost when these recipes disappeared was not the food itself. Most of it deserved to be forgotten. What we lost was the knowledge that you can make do, that scarcity does not mean deprivation, and that the difference between having nothing and having enough is often just creativity and a willingness to try. The 1940s taught a generation that food does not have to be fancy to be sufficient, that a can of salmon and some breadcrumbs can become dinner, and that dessert can happen even when the pantry is nearly bare. The recipes tried to be erased, not by history, but by prosperity. When butter became plentiful again, nobody wanted to remember victory cake. When chicken became affordable, city chicken disappeared. When gelatin stopped being impressive, the molds went into the back of the cupboard and stayed there. Progress erased them, which is natural. But memory preserved them, which is also natural. And now they sit in the space between forgotten and remembered, waiting for someone to ask what people used to eat and why and what it meant. If you lived through the 1940s, these recipes are not curiosities. They are your childhood. They are Tuesday nights and Sunday dinners and church potlucks and birthday parties. They are your mother standing at the stove, your father sitting at the table, your siblings crowding around with forks in their hands. The food was ordinary then. It is extraordinary now, not because it was good, but because it was real. If you did not live through the 1940s, these recipes are a window into a world that operated under different rules, where convenience meant something you could make quickly with what was already in the pantry, where elegance meant a gelatin mold that did not collapse, and where a good meal was one that filled you up and did not cost too much. It was a world that made sense to the people living in it, even if it seems baffling now. The recipes are gone, but the principles remain. Use what you have. Waste nothing. Make it work. Feed people. Those principles do not expire. They do not go out of style. They just wait quietly until they are needed again, and then they come back. The same way dandelion greens came back, and lard came back, and Sunday pot roast never really left. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. If this brought back memories, or taught you something, or just made you grateful you were not eating liver loaf last Tuesday, I am glad you stayed. If you have your own stories about 1940s food or recipes your mother or grandmother made, leave them in the comments. I would love to hear them. And if you enjoyed this, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one, more kitchens to walk through, more tables to sit at. We are also on Spotify now if you prefer listening there. The link is in the description. The 1940s are over. The recipes are mostly forgotten. But the people who made them, who ate them, who fed their families with whatever they could find, are worth remembering. Not because the food was good, though some of it was, but because they showed up every day and made something out of almost nothing. And that is worth more than any recipe. Take care of yourself. We will talk again soon.